Okay, let's say you are designing an airplane, kind of like this one that I've got on screen here. Clearly vertical takeoff and landing, clearly it wants to go forward on the wing as well. How would you design a flight control system for this type of airplane? And before we can answer that question, we want to ask kind of a fundamental question about how you fly airplanes. And here's the interesting answer to that. No matter what type of airplane you have, I don't care if it's an F-16, a Cessna 172, and really even this kind of even applies to helicopters. When you pull back on the stick in an airplane, what you want is to raise the nose up to a positive angle of attack. In other words, when you pull back on the stick, if the airplane is going this way, you want to raise the nose up from its flight path to get a positive angle of attack and increase that lift. Something that's really weird is when you get on the rudder pedals, or in this case, twist the stick, what you're doing is you're pushing the nose off to the side of the flight path, getting that nose off to the left or right. So here's what's so cool. The stick and rudder in an airplane, what they both do is deflect the nose of the airplane away from the direction the airplane is going. Isn't that interesting? Both the elevator and the rudders cause the nose to come up above the flight path a certain amount, or off to the left or right, or below the flight path a certain amount. They deflect the nose of the airplane away from the direction the airplane is going. And this is fine for airplanes that are flying horizontally. It's a perfectly nice way to fly an airplane. But what happens when you're in hover? When you're in hover, you're not going at all. How do you deflect the nose above or below or off to the side of the flight path when there is no flight path? In hover, you're not moving forwards. There's no flight path. Angle of attack and side slip become literally meaningless. How do you control the airplane then? Well, if you want to build a vertical takeoff and landing airplane that both has a flight control system that lets you hover when flight path is completely undefined and move forwards with the nose going up, down, left, or right compared to the flight path, you are clearly going to need two different types of flight control systems with the transfer between one and the other, which will take us to the screen that you are looking at right now in PlaneMaker, hopefully, which is the Artificial Stability ArtStab screen. And this is where you can enter a flight control system. So let's look at what I did for my V44, as I call it here. My big heavy lift quad rotor, tilt rotor is clearly like two ospreys glued together. What we have in the upper section is the low speed system. And this is clearly the system where we don't know what angle of attack is. We don't know what side slip is, because since the airplane's not moving, angle of attack and side slip are undefined. Remember, angle of attack and side slip are how far the nose is displaced from the forward velocity of the airplane. There is no forward velocity of the airplane, there is no angle of attack or side slip, they're undefined. Like, right, if you want to visualize this, what's the angle of attack of a Cessna 172 that's tied down on the ramp? It's undefined. So that's what we have with an airplane in hover. So the upper section here is for the low speed handling, where there is no angle of attack and side slip. The lower section is for the high speed handling, where angle of attack and side slip are defined. All right, so when there's no angle of attack, what do you want the stick to do? No longer can the stick, raise or lower the nose compared to flight path, or kick the nose left and right compared to flight path. What are you gonna do with the joystick? And what I decided is you will let the joystick control the pitch, roll, and yaw rates. In other words, simply how fast the airplane is moving. So if you push the stick forwards or back, that's going to control how fast the nose comes up or down, or how fast the airplane rolls left or right, by the way, and how fast it yaws left and right. This is clearly exactly what helicopters do, right? When a helicopter is in hover, however much you move the stick off to the side, well, that's how fast the helicopter is going to rotate. And so basically at low speed, what you want is for the pitch rotation rate to be linear with stick deflection, the roll rotation rate to be linear with stick deflection and roll, and the heading deflection rate to be linear with the stick rotation and yaw, or of course rudder pedals, if that's what you've got. So let's take a look at how we actually do that. The first thing we do is go with the basic stick input that the pilot's got. All right, and what we're talking about here in this screen is the actual flight controls that make it out to the ailerons, elevators, and rudders. Okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add some input to the joystick. So when we fly this airplane, an X-plane with the joystick, sure, the joystick is going to move the ailerons, elevators, and rudders, but we're going to add some deflection of those flight controls with an algorithm to make the airplane way easier to fly and hover. What is the algorithm? Well, start with your stick input, and if you want, you can make the airplane feel more like synthetic and less natural, and maybe cut your raw stick input in half, for example. So we start with the raw stick input. How much of the actual joystick input the pilot is making goes out to the elevators, aileron, and rudder. Then for the hover, the low speed situation, remember in hover we don't have angle of attack, so we do pitch, heading, and roll rates. It looks like I've entered 30 degrees for commanded pitch rate, 60 degrees for commanded roll rate, and 30 degrees for commanded heading rate. So in other words, this is how fast the flight control system wants the airplane to roll and pitch and yaw when you're in hover, when you have a full stick deflection. Okay, yay. That's fine that that's what you want. How are you going to get it? And the answer is clearly you have to drive the flight controls. How much do you drive the flight controls? Well, it looks like what I entered that seemed to work for this airplane was 0.04 fraction of control deflection per degree per second difference. All right, what does that mean? Well, it means if I have the stick, let's say, all the way back, well, that's going to command a 30 degree per second pitch up rate of the airplane. Well, if the airplane is actually pitching up at 0 degrees per second right now, because I just pulled the stick back, but I'm commanding it to pitch up at 30 degrees per second, the difference is 30 degrees. What's 30 times 0.04? What is that, 0.12? No, it's 1.2, isn't it? So let's pull out the little calculator because I don't want to mess up my zeros on a video. 0.04 times 30, yeah, I just don't want to mess up my decimals on y'all. It's 1.2. So in other words, there will be 120% control deflection added when you pull the stick all the way back and hover. Now, you cannot exceed 100% control deflections. That's going to get capped at 100%. But what that means is if you jam the stick all the way back in this airplane, it's going to go full scale, nose up elevator. Ditto that with roll rate and heading rate. Now, this system will be used, it looks like, below 60 knots. In other words, if this airplane is ever below 60 knots, this is something like, oh, I don't know, a 90 knot flying speed or something like that, probably for the transition, maybe 120 knots. Below 60 knots, that's the system we're going to use. 50% of your stick input plus commanding these pitch, heading, and roll rates with stick input by multiplying the desired pitch, heading, and roll rate minus the pitch, heading, and roll rate you've already got times 0.04. If you want the stick to the elevator and the aileron and the rudder to move more to get a snappier response, maybe change the 04 to an 05. All right, so that's the low speed. Now, let's talk about the high speed. Once we get moving, we do not want to just fly pitch rate anymore, right? Imagine the airplane's at red line speed. There's all this dynamic pressure, all this lift, and then it just decides to pitch up at 30 degrees per second. That's going to break the airplane. That's just to be like, that's going to be way too much lift. So once you get moving, you want the stick to fly an angle of attack and a side slip. Still does a roll rate, interestingly. The roll rate is the same at low speed and high speed. You still want the stick to control roll. So what do? Up here, let's just say we follow the stick input put in by the pilot. Okay, that's 1.0 raw stick input. And then we're going to command, let's say, 15 degrees angle of attack at full stick deflection. So you pull the nose all the way back. This flight control system is going to want 15 degrees per second. Side slip at full pedal deflection, 0. So this thing's always going to try and hold 0 side slip. It's going to try and just keep the nose pointed straight ahead. But you still will get side slip because remember, the stick is being added. The flight control system just isn't adding in more desired side slip. And then finally, the flight deflection per degree difference from commanded. So in other words, if you are at 0 angle of attack in this airplane in flight and you pull the stick all the way back, you're commanding 15 degrees angle of attack. What's 15 times 0.1? 1.5. That's all of your control authority and another 50% beyond. Again, the control's gonna be capped at 100%, but it means all the elevator you've got is gonna try and pull that nose up to try and get you your 15 degrees angle of attack. For roll rate, for every degree short of your desired roll rate, it's going to feed in 0.02 or 2% of your ailerons. And then for every degree side slip you are away from 0, which is to say any bit away from side slip, it's going to feed in half of the rudder to counteract that. So it's really going to try to hold 0 side slip. it's going to like take away from that stick deflection as the nose goes off to the side. A good flight control system also looks into the future. A good flight control system doesn't look at what the airplane is doing right now, because just due to latency of computers and latency of propellers to spin up and latency of controls to move and latency for airplanes to get accelerating and moving in a given direction, if flight control systems look at what the airplane is doing now, they'll always be a bit late and they'll be swerving like a drunk driver. So what they need to do is they need to anticipate into the future. They need to make a decision with flight control deflection based not on what the airplane is doing now, but what the airplane will be doing soon based on the accelerations it's undergoing. So look, the flight control system for angle of attack looks 0.2 seconds into the future. So in other words, this thing is going to apply an elevator to give you 15 degrees angle of attack when the stick is all the way back, based not on what the angle of attack is now, but based on what the angle of attack will be in 0.2 seconds based on the pitch rate of the airplane. And so if you think about that, what that means is when that nose is pitching up really rapidly, the flight control system is saying, wait a minute, I'm not at 15 degrees angle of attack now, but I'm gonna be at 15 degrees angle of attack in 0.2 seconds. I better get off the flight controls now. And it's that anticipation that causes the flight controls to be smooth, because they start backing out as the airplane starts approaching its target angle of attack or roll rate or side slip or whatever it is you're trying to hit. So anticipating into the future with the flight control system is absolutely critical. This system will be used entirely above 120 knots, and between 60 knots and 120 knots, it's interpolate smoothly in between. So this is my kind of generic flight control system that lets you command pitch, heading, and roll rates in hover, and angle of attack and side slip and roll rates in forward flight, and transition between the two for those ever fascinating vertical takeoff and landing airplanes. Now, at the bottom of this screen, we have something a little bit interesting, the auto coordination system. This is just a yaw damper, and we have yaw dampers on Boeings, Moonies, all kinds of airplanes have yaw dampers. And all a yaw damper is this little controller for the rudder in the back of the airplane, just to try to stop the airplane from yawing off to the side too much. That's all a yaw damper is. Tons of planes have them, and you can have a yaw damper in X-plane even if you don't have this fancy low speed and high speed flight control system. Beta to rudder rate gain, and this is written ever so slightly differently. Philip Munsell programmed this particular system. I programmed this one. But what we have is a beta to rudder rate gain. Beta is side slip, by the way. And so what that means is however fast that side slip is generating, in other words, however fast that nose is going off to the right, well, that's how much the rudder is going to counteract that. So for example, if the rudder is going, or if the nose is popping off to the right at 10 degrees per second, heading off at 10 degrees per second to the right, well, 10 times 0.1 is 1. That would give a full rudder in opposition to the rotation rate. And so the yaw damper is kind of damping out the rate the airplane is moving. But why damp out the rate? Why not also deflect the rudder by however much the nose is kind of statically displaced? If the airplane's kind of flying along like this, how about have some rudder trying to center that thing up, even though it's not actually rotating actively? Well, that's your beta to rudder proportional gain. If you're under 0.1, well, then if you're flying along with a 10-degree side slip, well, 10 times 0.1 is 1. That'll be a full rudder trying to cock the nose back into your direction of travel again. And beta to rudder integral gain, and this should probably be less. The integral gain says that if you are off to the side, it's going to gradually keep integrating, building up more and more and more rudder to try and get the aircraft to go straight again. So this is going to build up rudder deflection over time. And so if you look at all three of these constants, you realize how nice this can be. Imagine you're in, I don't know, a King Air or something, two big engines, one on either side, and then one engine fails. Well, what's going to happen? The nose is going to accelerate off to the right, as that engine is only pulling on one side. The plane's going to go, as the airplane starts rotating, well, the yaw damper is going to detect that as a rate, a rotation rate, and the rudder is going to oppose that rotation rate. Then, as the airplane has actually made it to being deflected off to the side, as the airplane is actually flying along in a side slip now with all that thrust from one side, the rudder is going to deflect to try and take out that side slip as well. And then, if the pilot doesn't take any corrective action at all, the rudder thinks the integral is going to gradually build up enough force to get that nose centered over time. And so in theory, you could design a yaw damper to let an airplane fly with no side slip over time after an engine failure in a King Air, even if you never touch the rudders. In theory, such a system could be designed. And so, hey, why don't you try it?